Hello and welcome to this talk for the 2021 annual Psychology and Sociology Conference at West Suffolk College. I'm Robin Herne and I'll be talking to you about the Polarised Mind. And if you're wondering what the Polarised Mind is about, it's looking at the theories of American psychologist George Kelly, who developed a technique referred to as the repertory grid, which was used, and still is used, by a number of therapists as an aid to delving into the psychology of their clientele. The repertory grid is supported by personal construct theory, which is the broader context that Kelly developed for explaining how people's minds tend to operate, both in healthy fashions and in more dysfunctional fashions. And coming at it from a therapeutic point of view, his interest tended to be more in the dysfunctional side of it. So we're going to focus on that for the purposes of this lecture. And next year, at West Suffolk College, we're launching a criminology degree, and so I'm going to try and tie this into issues directly and more indirectly associated with forms of dysfunctional behaviour that lead to crime. So we'll have a look in that sort of direction. Now, this is George Kelly himself, born in America. Didn't live a hugely long life, as you can see, died in his early 60s. Came from an educational psychological background, worked in schools and colleges, developing theories and ideas to aid with improving teaching and learning. And went on to devise personal construct theory, which was released in one of his more prominent books, The Psychology of Personal Constructs, which sadly is no longer in print, but if this is a topic that inspires interest in you, then second-hand bookshops are the place to hunt for copies of that book. Now, what is a personal construct? Where do they come from? Well, a personal construct is what the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget referred to as a schema, sometimes also referred to by the term schemata. Schema and schemata are interchangeable as concepts. A schema is a way of categorizing and understanding the world. It's a belief about things out there. Now, early on in his career, Kelly was interested in many of the same areas that Jean Piaget was interested in terms of understanding how constructs or schema develop about everything we encounter. So the small child develops a construct, or schema if you prefer, about what a dog is, what a cat is, what a bird is, what a tree is. It's learning about the world as you encounter it. And both Piaget and Kelly had this idea that humans are rather like amateur scientists, amateur zoologists, amateur botanists, etc. That as we learn about the world for the very first time, when we're very, very young, each discovery is exciting and thrilling. We want to know more about it. We want to get a mental grip upon what this thing is. And our parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, school teachers, scoutmasters, Girl Guide leaders, the vicar, 101 other people around us as we're growing up, help to shape our constructs, help to shape our schema, sometimes very directly, such as where a parent will say, trying to teach a child to speak, or say a doggy or cat or horse or whatever, and then point to things. And if the child makes mistakes, so the child points to a cat and says dog, the mother or father might say, "Oh no, dear, that's a cat," and then help to reinforce in the child's mind the notion that a cat is different from a dog. And they might give an explanation of some sort, probably a very simple explanation to a young child, as to quite how a cat differs from a dog. And as the child gets older, they learn more, and obviously these days we have to factor in the tremendous influence of television and the internet in terms of shaping the minds of children. And of course books, if the child is hopefully an avid reader, and they acquire knowledge of their own. So it's not simply a matter that we are exposed to personal constructs given to us by other people around us. but that we also hunt out information ourselves. We are active scientists in search of knowledge, not simply sponges sitting there having knowledge tipped onto us in buckets by the people around us. Now, a point which both Kelly and, to a lesser extent, Piaget noted, and this perhaps is something, if any of you have ever learned to drive and you've been taught at least part of it, perhaps by a relative, rather than by a professional driving instructor, that people with, what should we say, bad habits, when it comes to things like driving, can pass on those bad habits when they're teaching. So the absorption of knowledge doesn't always mean the knowledge is accurate. You can absorb inaccurate knowledge without you being aware that the knowledge is inaccurate. So you may be given misinformation by someone who genuinely believes it themselves. Their bad habits, their peculiar outlooks. And when it comes to matters where emotionalism and bias are very prominent factors to think of, we will absorb those along with more factual data. So we might pick up on somebody else's very passionately held political views or religious views, which could be very constructive, very upbeat, very optimistic views, or equally they could be very scathing and negative views. So someone who is very, let's say, very racist or very sexist or very whatever, or despises Catholics or hates Jews or whatever kind of hang-up they may have, they are likely to pass that on to the impressionable minds around them. And it may be that in the years afterwards, the impressionable mind in question starts in due course to question the validity of what they have absorbed. But in the early stages, we just tend to absorb information in a rather willy-nilly fashion, without too much discrimination, particularly when we're very young and we're not in a position to ask critical questions about what we're being told. That's a faculty that comes later. And some researchers, like Lawrence Kohlberg, who looked into the development of ethics and morality, suggested that some people can get to the age of 40, 50, 60, 70 and still never really develop those critical faculties and just believe what they are told with a kind of naive gullibility. So not everyone necessarily does develop a critical faculty, but hopefully the majority of people do. So our personal constructs, our ideas about the world, which range from everything such as our notion as to what a dog or a cat or a horse is, all the way through to our notions of truth and fairness and love and God and capitalism, communism, socialism, all of those kind of big, grand ideas, whether it's a small idea or a grandiose idea, all of that classes, from Kelly's point of view, as personal constructs. These are ideas constructed in our minds. Now, a key issue to bear in mind, and I will make an effort to keep the focus here on psychology rather than drift into sociology, but there is an overlap between the two subjects, and it's always worth bearing in mind that whilst we have individual minds, the content of my mind is not 100% the same as the content of the minds of any of the people listening to this, lucky you. Nonetheless, almost every idea, and it's hard to think of an exception to this, so pretty much every idea really is shared with at least some other people. So whilst the exact contents of my mind may be unique and the exact contents of your mind are unique, nonetheless elements of it are rather like a Venn diagram where we have overlaps with other people. So there are billions of people on the planet who have a notion as to what a dog is, and they may not have exactly the same notion as each other, depending on what dogs they've seen, what part of the world they live in, etc. But they will have similarities in common with large swathes of other people. Equally, there are vast numbers of people who have an idea what Christianity is, what Islam is, what Buddhism is. Vast numbers of people who have an idea of what right-wing politics or left-wing politics or centrist politics are. And if we want to bring it into the context of a kind of a hot topic in the modern psychological and sociological and criminological areas of study. Vast numbers of people have an idea what black people are like, what Asian people are like, what white people are like, what gay people or straight people or disabled people or able-bodied people are like. So it's not just notions of cats and dogs and trees and daffodils, it's notions of other human beings, what they are like. And those ideas are partly down to direct personal experience, direct encounters. So each time the young child sees another type of dog, maybe the first type of dog they've ever seen was a Chihuahua, and then a year later they see a St. Bernard's. And in their mind they've got to then adjust that a Chihuahua, tiny little Chihuahua, and a big old St. Bernard's dog are somehow the same thing. They're both dogs, even though they look exceedingly different from each other, but they're related. So our idea of what a Christian believes, or our idea of what a SDB voter believes, or what a gay person is like, or what a straight person is like, is based initially upon immediate encounters with people from those categories, but also upon what you might call second-hand encounters. So even if you've never met, let's say you live in America and you've never in your life met a person who voted for the SDP because you've never been to Scotland, so you've got no direct experience, but nonetheless you might watch TV programs, you might read websites, you might read books, you might have a friend who has a friend who has a friend who lives in Scotland and votes for the SDP, so you can be exposed to second-hand information. So some of it is immediate experience, which for some people may be very, very limited, and other people they may meet wider and wider varying types of individuals. So just as you can encounter a wide variety of different types of dogs, different types of cats, different types of horses, so you can encounter, obviously, very, very different types of people. And so somebody with very limited experience may have a view of a particular notion or category or type of person that's quite basic, quite simplistic, and assume naively that everyone in that category must be pretty much the same, based upon the very limited experience they've had. Others who've had a much broader experience, met a wider variety of people from within a singular category, have perhaps hopefully a more complex and more developed, more rounded notion of what people are like. And as you meet new people, it requires a change and a development of existing ideas. Now, it's important to bear in mind that constructs, you could say very much the same if we were talking about Jean Piaget's idea of a scheme, operating in a very similar way. They are open to revision, they're open to change and development as new information comes along. So the child mentioned earlier who sees a Chihuahua when they're 2 years old and then sees a St. Bernard's dog when they're 4 years old has to revise their notion as to quite what a dog is, to expand that category outwards. So as we are opened to new information, our constructs, well, they don't automatically change, and this is a point that Kelly emphasised, but they are capable of changing. If our minds are flexible enough, open enough, willing enough to absorb the new information. Where people can become dysfunctional is when they are very resistant to change. They have an idea and it's fixed in their head, and they will cling on to it like a limpet no matter what new information they're exposed to, and they are very, very resistant to change. That can lead to significant problems. Sometimes the problems might be very minor, but sometimes those problems can be very large. It depends on the nature of the construct we're thinking about. The main purpose, if we can put it like that, is not an ideal way of saying it, but a key aspect of constructs is that they are functional. They're there to help us get on in life. We have an idea, a mental representation in our heads as to what the world is like around us. And, it's an issue we'll come to again in a few moments, what we ourselves are like. So it's not just an outward-facing understanding, it's also an inward turning, where we have a self-construct. Who am I as Robin? who is somebody else, Dave, Mary, Bhupinder, whoever, somebody who has an idea of who they are. We all have ideas of who we are, and those self-ideas are open to revision. So your notion of who you are when you're 8 years old will, hopefully, have changed by the time you're 18 years old, and again changed by the time you're 45 years old, and again have changed by the time you are 87 years old. So your notions of self develop just as your notions of what the outer world is like develop. These notions are functional in as much as a healthy mind has constructs that enable them to engage with the world around them in a positive, creative, happy, harmonious fashion. A person whose engagement with the world is awkward, difficult, distressing, causes them great unhappiness, maybe causes other people great unhappiness, their constructs, or at least some of them at any rate, have ceased to be functional. And that becomes an issue that might result in them needing to see a therapist or a counsellor. Possibly they might end up in a courtroom, depending on quite how dysfunctional those ideas are. It could lead to all sorts of problems in life. And this as an idea has become widely accepted into other forms of therapy, like cognitive behavioural therapy, for example. The research of Beck and of Ellis owes a tremendous debt to the ideas initially advanced by George Kelly. The sense of constructs being a filter that colour experience. If you go through life expecting certain types of people, or certain experiences, or certain places to be terrible and dreadful, that will shape how you experience them. Because you will automatically expect it to be awful even before you've encountered the person or the place or the institution or whatever it might be that you have a construct about. Equally, if you have this glowing, rosy, idealised version of what they're going to be like, that will flavour and colour your experience. It sets up expectations, and that overlaps with this notion of constructs being a tool for predicting the future, because part of the functionality of a construct is not only to describe how you believe the world is right now, but also how you expect it to be tomorrow, next month, next year, next decade. It shapes the way you view the world in the future, if indeed you even think there is a future. So to give you a reasonably topical example, climate change is a construct. It's an idea that a lot of people have about what is going on with the climate. Not everyone shares the same construct. You get a variety of different views from different people about what's going on with the climate, but the notion that the climate is being radically changed as a consequence of human behaviour and industrialisation and so forth, coupled with the fear that really quite large numbers of people have that the world as we know it may not last much longer, that the climate may alter so enormously that the planet becomes nigh on uninhabitable for vast swathes of people, and for a lot of individuals and groups. And again, this is reflective of the extent to which personal constructs are shaped by social interaction with other people, exposure to their ideas, their views. Those constructs pass from mind to mind to mind. There are large numbers of people who think that within 10 years, 12 years, 20 years, the world will be nigh on uninhabitable. That is a construct that's shaping their expectations of the future in a very, very pessimistic fashion, a kind of a vision of potential looming doom. Some people believe that vision of the future can be diverted. It is something that can yet be changed. Other people think it's inevitable and there's not a damn thing that anyone can do to avoid it. Yeah, and a variety of other views of the future, variations on that theme. But it's shaping what people expect of the future, which then might lead to a significant impact on how they might make decisions in their own lives. if you think the world is going to be uninhabitable in 10 years, there's a lot of things that perhaps aren't worth investing in if you don't think, what's the point of paying into a pension plan if you don't think you're going to live long enough to enjoy the benefits of it. So it's small things like that can have a huge impact on the choices we make. This huge vision of the future might lead to somebody deciding not to bother with a pension, not to bother with studying, not to bother with this, that, the other. Somebody else might decide to live it up in the short term because they don't think there's going to be a long term in which to enjoy their lives. So you could get all sorts of different reactions to that. Now, the element of citing the past, straying very briefly into the area of sociology, the American sociologist Judith Butler developed this idea that she refers to as citationality. And sociologists love the longer the word is, the more sociologists love it. Citationality, she talks about that mainly in regards to gender behaviour, but you could apply it to a whole raft of other things, is the way in which we maintain constructs in the present by citing to examples from the past. This is the way somebody else did it last week, last month, last century, therefore it is true now. And so the construct connects where we are in the present to where we and other people have been in the past and where we're going in the future. So there is this sort of a chronological placement of the construct in the process of our life experience and the passage of time. And it becomes a way of understanding the world through time as well as through space. There are three elements where this can go wrong, according to Kelly, and that might well lead to somebody being in therapy or finding themselves in other rather tricky situations where they have to hopefully find a positive way out. Anxiety is a factor that develops, obviously is a very popular topic of discussion on social media, people defining themselves as having anxiety and so on. In the context that Kelly meant it, he said that people often experience anxiety when they encounter a new situation for which they have no existing construct. That could be a brand new technology and all those jokes about parents, grandparents, etc. not knowing how to use certain forms of technology which 6-year-olds adapt to with remarkable ease, but sometimes older generations struggle with. It's a bit stereotypical, I know, but a situation perhaps some of those of you listening can relate to, in either in your own life or in relatives, friends. Somebody who goes on holiday or emigrates to a very different country with a very, very different culture, where they very different language, etc. They don't know how to relate to the world around them. It's a very alien experience for a period of time. Will induce a great deal of anxiety until the individual starts to develop constructs to understand what on earth is happening. So the anxiety exists in that period when we don't know what the hell is going on around us. Once we start to acquire a construct, the anxiety subsides because we begin to get a grip and get a handle on what's going on in the world around us. So anxiety here for Kelly is a temporary situation that arises in reaction to a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding, a lack of the construct which would act as rather like a compass, giving us our sense of bearings and directions. Even a dysfunctional construct has an element of reassurance about it. So in a weird sense, it's better to have a dysfunctional construct than no construct at all. In that even a dysfunctional one gives at least the illusion of understanding what's going on, whereas the absence of a construct, you're faced with anxiety and fear that you don't know where you are, what's going on, or anything. Guilt, he says, comes from this sense of dislodgement, which is an odd choice of word, where our core constructs are undermined and shaken by an event that happens. Something happens that makes us really question our core construct, and then we feel bad that somehow we have let the construct down, because the construct is more important, in our minds at least, than the ongoing experiences of the world. Now that's particularly so where the core construct, and there are core constructs and peripheral constructs. Core constructs are ones that take huge centre place in our life and define a very large chunk of our life. A peripheral construct is a more minor thing, and it's usually much more readily adaptable to new experiences, new information, new ideas. So that the child who has to expand their construct of dog from Chihuahua to include and incorporate St. Bernards, that might be a peripheral one, because it doesn't alter fundamentally who the child is to have to take on board an idea of what this brand new type of dog is like. A core construct might go to the very heart of who we feel we are and the centre of our world. So, a couple of examples on the slide there. Someone who regards themselves as incredibly attractive and dynamic, they can snap their fingers and get any woman or any man they want, and they're used to, because they're very, very good looking, they're very charming, etc., etc., maybe for years on end they've had practically any sexual partner they're fancied, and suddenly one day somebody says, "Oh, no thank you, I'm not interested, go away." What for other people might be a minor, trivial experience, a minor rebuff, and a lot of other people might think, "Oh, well, never mind," and move on from it. For the person who is not used to that rejection, it could be a huge blow to their construct. Not, we might be casually talk about a blow to the ego, and there is an element of that to it, but Kelly is saying this isn't just about egotism. This is about a sense of who you are. And if who you are is questioned, that is very undermining. So say somebody who's a doctor or a nurse or whatever, who's had a tremendous success rate, they've saved no end of lives, they're very accomplished in their profession, and one day they lose a patient. The patient dies. They can't save them, they die. Again, if you're used to understanding yourself in a certain light, I am the kind of person who always does X, and suddenly X doesn't happen. Who are you anymore? And that results in a tremendous sense of guilt. So the guilt may be partly to the patient who has died, but also to the sense that your self-construct, the great healer, the great nurse, the great doctor, the great whatever, has been damaged. The construct has been let down. We might say the person feels they've let themselves down. Kelly would say they feel they've let their own self-construct down. It would lead to questions. Hostility, anger, aggression, verbal aggression, possibly physical aggression in violence, is a reaction to, and we'll go back to that point we made a little bit earlier, people who are very resistant to change. Someone who's got such an intense attachment to a particular construct that when an event does happen that would require the construct to be revised and changed and altered in some way to take on board the new information, they, instead of doing that, instead of having the flexibility to take on the new information, they try to cling to the old version of the construct and get very, very angry at any attempt to change it and lash out at whoever or whatever they feel is trying to push a change. They deny it, they reject it, they may physically lash out at a person. You might say rather like that ancient Greek idea of killing the messenger because you don't like the message. So the individual might be targeted, or they come up with a rationalization that means they can keep on going with their old version of the construct by somehow downplaying the new information. So, as per the suggestion on the slide, you could have someone who really does not like gay people, has a very, very negative view of gay people, sort of rants and raves about it, and has been doing so for years and years and years, and then they discover that their best friend is actually gay. It's something they'd never realised until that moment in time. Now, do they What do they do? Because they've had an idea in their head, gay people are X, they're like this. But here's my friend, I really, really like them, and they are nothing like X. Do they reject their friend outright? Some people would. Do they say, oh, you've lied to me, you've deceived me, you're just pretending to be likeable, and in fact you're not likeable? They might do. Do they say, oh, well, you're all right, it's the others. You're the exception, everyone else is the rule. So you are the one token person I will allow under the radar. Everyone else is exactly the same as I thought they always were. The more flexible mind, the healthier mind, would perhaps revise their assumption as to what gay people are like, to expand to include their understanding of their best friend. And the friendship would continue, and they'd learn to adjust their mind. Whereas the more rigid mind would struggle with that and would start to get angry. Doesn't mean they'd necessarily attack the individual, but they might do. And returning to this kind of linkage into criminology, there is always the potential there that the level of anger might lead to violence. Violence against the person, violence against a property, burning a building down, bricking windows, violence against an institution. And it doesn't always have to be in the context of bigotry and prejudice. It can be in a whole raft of different contexts. As the person feels attacked, and that fundamentally is what's going on here. Their hostility is a reaction to a perceived threat. The threat is to their construct. But that construct is so dear to their heart that they don't want to change because they've lived with it for so long. A quote from Doctor Who, the Fourth Doctor, Tom Baker. Which reflects this hostility, if you like, that there are individuals in the world. They may be the very powerful, or they may, as the Doctor there suggests, be the very stupid. And so if we are being generous, people who are not necessarily very stupid, but let's say very rigid in their thinking, who are in a position to respond where someone or some event or some situation happens that doesn't fit their pre-existing construct, their view. They are in a position to try and force that person or that situation to fit their view. In other words, they refuse to change their construct. It is the event, the person, the situation that has to be made to change instead. That may be done in a rather bizarre way and perhaps provoke laughter from other people, but sometimes it may be done in a way that is frankly criminal or dangerous or destructive in some capacity and could lead, as the Doctor there suggests, to some very uncomfortable situations if you are the person that has to be altered to make somebody else comfortable in continuing to view the world in the way they always have done. So give some examples of how disordered constructs, and that disordered construct is the term that Kelly favours, rather than dysfunctional. He tends to favour disordered. The result is much the same. Ideological extremism is one factor to consider. Somebody who insists on seeing the world in a certain way, and when the world does not fit their expectations as to how it should be, they lash out. They harm, they damage, they injure, maybe emotionally, maybe materially, economically, by causing material property damage and things like that, maybe physically by attacking people, maybe injuring them, maybe killing them. They will have a tendency to lash out at the world. And we could understand from using Kelly's approach that ideological extremism, whether that's political extremism or religious extremism or any other kind of extremism, can be understood as an example of this very, very rigid thinking, where the world has to be understood in a very specific way and nothing is allowed to challenge that. And if it dares to challenge it, then the response is hostility. anger, potentially violence, possibly even murderous violence in very extreme situations, a lashing out at the world to make it fit the expectation as to how it should be. The anxiety levels, which we've just mentioned, can lead to fight or flight. So people running away from frightening news situations, not in terms of, well, I don't want to know anything about this new type of technology. I don't want that part of my life. I'm going to avoid it, ignore it, run away from it. Or I don't want to go on holiday to that country. I don't want to move to that country. I don't want to meet people from that group. They're strange, they're weird, they're peculiar. I don't want to have anything to do with them. And the tendency to withdraw, which, if it's a situation which maybe an individual is obliged to engage with because of their job or something like that, that could put them in a difficult position where their job may become at risk because they refuse to engage with a particular group of people or a particular activity, particular technology, whatever it may be. They want to pull away from it. Or, again, the fight element rather than the flight element might lead to aggression. We're back to the hostility situation, where people start to verbally or physically lash out against the thing that they are estranged from, the thing that they do not understand. And from a therapeutic point of view, what you do about this is to help that person to acquire a construct of the thing they do not understand. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to use the particular, let's say, I don't see the point of Instagram or TikTok at all. Should I be forced to do so? Well, possibly some people might say yes, but from Kelly's point of view, I don't have to be forced to, but having it, because you can have a construct of something, an idea of what it is, without necessarily using it. So having my acquiring a better understanding of what those technologies do, what they're for, why other people use them, doesn't oblige me to use them as well, but might make them less off-putting, because I then have a better understanding of what they are. There are other situations where obviously a person might be obliged, because of the nature of their job or where they live or what have you, to engage with something that they'd much sooner run away from. But the helpful approach is essentially education, to help them get a better grip on the thing that they find completely strange, completely alien, so that they can have a, if not an engagement with it, at least an understanding of it and where it fits into the greater world. The response to the very rigid thought, the one that results in hostility, is more therapeutic. It is more in terms of assisting that person to be less afraid, less rigid in their thinking, to understand that they can have a still positive engagement with the world, even by changing their long-held, long-cherished views and experiences and constructs of a particular thing. That the change to the construct doesn't necessarily mean the end of everything for them, or mean that it's all going to become terrible and awful and dreadful. They can still go on having a very positive experience of themselves and the world, even with their constructs being altered in some way. But that's quite a difficult thing to convince some people of. On the right-hand column of the slide there, we're moving into this area of, going back to the title of this talk, the polarized mind, into dichotomous, or if you prefer, polarized thinking. That part of Kelly's understanding of how constructs develop, which we'll get onto in a little bit more detail in a moment, is that we have a tendency, and he says this is pretty much everyone has this tendency, to think in rather extreme terms, in a sense of either or. What used to be called black and white thinking, that everything is either at that extreme or it's at that extreme, and there's very little nuance and sense of how things sit in the middle. And that can lead to either fetishizing certain people, or certain organisations or certain places or what have you, as being all good, all wonderful, all perfect, or demonising them as being all bad, all terrible, all wicked, all awful. And in either case, both the fetishised and the demonised way of thinking are very unhelpful. Because as Kelly points out, the world is a very nuanced, subtle grey place. It's neither white nor black, it's neither one extreme nor the other extreme. It's a mixture. And to operate effectively in the world, we need that more nuanced understanding. So neither the putting people on a pedestal nor slinging them into a pit is very helpful to daily living and interaction. Now, this is an example of the repertory grid, which is a technique used in both therapeutic circles, but it's also quite popular as a training tool on work days and things like that for occupational psychologists and those who work in the employment sector. It can be used in a whole variety of ways. Now, what the psychologist does is to get the individual that they're working with, or it could be a group of people that they're working with, to name a set of individuals. So on the slide there you've got Ted and Tony and Alan and Douglas and so on. There's a bunch of people. So it says to let's say it's a one-to-one, we'll keep it easy. So the therapist says to their client, name a group of people. That could be family, it could be friends, it could be people they work with, it could be people they hate, people they like, could be in a variety of different contexts. Name a bunch of people. So they've got the set of people. And then the therapist says to them, okay, so you've named Tony and you've named Shirley and you've named Bob. Now, tell me one thing that Tony has in common with Shirley, but which neither of them have in common with Bob. And so that's where we get to this either-or thinking. There's a factor which Tony and Shirley have that Bob does not. So there is a factor that's high here but low there. And the numbers you can see on the grid, numbers 1 to 5, one suggests the thing that Tony and Shirley have a lot of, they score very high on that, so that you give them a number 1 or a number 2, and the thing that Bob has very little of, you put him at the other end and he's a 4 or a 5. So it's asking the individual to create a Likert scale, which is a way of saying, well, you know, one end is very high on the scale and the other numbers at the other end of the scale are very low. Can you score these people on this quality? And having done it for those 3 people, if, as per the example in the slide here, you've got a bunch of people, more than 3 of them, you then go through each individual and say, well, you've just mentioned this quality where we'll take the first example there. Let's say you've got people who are really, really good specialists at their job and others who've just kind of fallen into their job without having any great talent for it or specialism for it. They're just kind of tripped into that job. Okay, let's go through everybody in your group and you tell me, are they a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or 4 or 5? Where do they score in terms of that job? Are they really, really good at it, or are they just kind of there by default, or are they somewhere in the middle? And you get them to score individuals on a whole series of qualities. Now, the example you have on the slide here is one that's been developed for a workplace engagement, a team training day. So it's not particularly relevant in terms of thinking of therapies and crimes and let's say more emotional dysfunction thinking. But you could utilise this in a whole raft of contexts. So let's say it was for family members and friends rather than people you work with. The qualities you'd understand, what does my dad have in common with my brother but that's different from my auntie? So, for example, you'd work through relatives in that way. And the notion is that the qualities the individual names start to reflect the constructs they have in their mind as to how they view those individuals, how they understand the world. It's teasing out the person's understanding of what is important. Which of these factors are significant constructs, which are not. And when it comes to this notion of polarization, it's helping to identify positives and negatives. Things they regard as really desirable, as good, as worth having, as aspirational, And equally, on the flip side, things they regard as negative, as problematic, as awful, wicked, terrible, whatever phrases you want to use to describe them, the good and the bad. One of the factors that Kelly flags up is that we tend, particularly if we're getting into those very rigid forms of thinking that might lead us into hostile behaviours and so on, when our thinking is challenged, we tend to categorise the world into positives and negatives. We tend to categorise ourselves into positives and negatives. So some people have a very positive view of themselves, other people have a very negative view of themselves. We tend to think in terms of extremes, not because we have been brought up badly or anything like that, but that's simply, he says, how the human mind tends to operate the world over. Clearly not absolutely everyone agrees with him, but that's the point he's trying to make. Some people regard this as kind of encouraging polarised thinking, whereas Kelly says it's not really encouraging it, because it's just pointing out exactly how people think anyway. We do think in a positive, negative way. Now, to give an example, one of my graduates who's finishing this year has just written a really good dissertation about cosmetic industry, plastic surgery, cosmetic surgery industry, I should say. People getting their appearance adjusted by surgeons. That's a really good example of this kind of dichotomous thinking, in that underpinning the whole plastic surgery industry is the notion that looking a certain way is good, is desirable. That if you have a certain shaped cheekbones, certain body shape, certain lack of wrinkles, this, that, the other, get Botox to hell and back again, you will be desirable. And desirable is good. Beautiful is good. Having a certain body shape, being slim is good. Looking younger than you probably are is good. And implicit in all that, of course, because you've got to pay for all of these treatments, implicit in it is that being wealthy is good. And so there is an alliance between the economic and the visual, between what you look like and the amount of money it requires to look like that. And you could go all sociological and branch off into 101 directions around feminist thinking and Marxist thinking and all sorts of other directions. But putting all that to one side, keeping it simple for the sake of today, we have this tendency. And you can look back to long before plastic surgery was a phenomenon. Think of children's fairy tales, the heroines and the heroes, the princesses and the brave knights and the rest of it, are always pretty and beautiful and handsome and young and well off because they're princes and princesses and the rest of it. There's a very kind of pattern of thinking of interrelated concepts that all come under the polarised end of goodness. And equally, the villains in fairy tales, the old witches and the gnarled up old wizards and what have you, are usually ugly, but sometimes either they're very fat or they're very scrawny and haggard looking, but they're not that kind of body perfect image. They're frequently old and they're frequently perceived as poor, staggering around dressed in rags and what have you. They're the old ugly weird things. Witch trials often targeted the old, the haggard, the desperately poor who lived in grinding poverty on the edges of villages and were a bit of a drain on the charitable coffers of the parish council. There is this perception that they are morally awful. You think of endless Hollywood films and Bollywood films and Nollywood films and the whole film industry the world over. The heroic characters, the lead characters tend to be glamorous actors and actresses, and the people playing the baddies tend to have a face on them like the back end of a bus. There is this polarisation where we expect the beautiful to be good, the ugly to be bad. And so we view the world in this very, very naive, very simplified fashion. Rationally, we know that there are good-looking people out there who are just awful. Ted Bundy, the serial killer, was a very handsome man, very charming, and everyone who, well, before he got arrested, loads of people thought he was absolutely lovely. And it turned out that he'd killed 50, or probably way more than that, people, and done all sorts of unsanitary, disgusting things we won't talk about here. And equally, there are people with faces on them that only a mother could love, who are just lovely, kind, caring, nice people. We know from reality, lived experience, that beauty does not always equate to moral goodness, that having a visually challenging face does not always equate to moral badness, that wealth doesn't equate to goodness, that poverty doesn't equate to badness, but Kelly was saying a lot of these constructs really operate at what Freud would have called a subconscious level. They're under the surface, and whatever consciously we try to make ourselves think differently, our subconscious constructs kick in, and we tend to see the world in these very stereotypical, very polarised terms, where everyone we meet is put either into the good box or the bad box. And there's very little sense of a nuanced box in the middle. And often what gets them lumped into the good box or lumped into the bad box is something very, very simplistic, and something that would not bear the light of much examination if we really thought about it. But we fall into these patterns of simplistic thinking. And that leads us to treat people in a very polarised way, and treat ourselves in a very polarised way. Thinking of how this might impact in the modern world, there is a computer genius and turned philosopher and a very accomplished musician as well, Jaron Lanier, an American inventor of computer systems, philosopher, musician, who says that social media is, and he suggests it's intentionally designed rather than accidentally designed, in such a way as to encourage much more polarised thinking, to push it to extremes. So pre-internet, yes, there were people thinking in polarised fashions, but he suggests that has been cranked up 100-fold by the very nature of how social media, it doesn't matter terribly which platform we're talking about, because he says they all tend to have this kind of an impact of leading to polarised thinking, where people dig their heels in and they convince themselves that everyone who thinks in manner X is either very, very good or very, very bad, and there's no nuance, there's no subtlety, there's no middle ground. We go to extremes. So for one person, voting Brexit might make you the worst individual in the world, and voting Remain might make you saintly, and for a different person it's the other way around. So in both cases it's individuals thinking in very extremist, very polarised ways, because they have constructs that start off with good and bad, and whereas that previous slide it was adding in beautiful, ugly, slim, overweight, rich, poor. For some people it might be pro-Brexit, anti-Brexit, it might be pro-Trump, anti-Trump, it might be this view on racial matters or that view on racial matters, this view on gender, that view on gender. It's whichever way it goes, we tend to have, essentially Lanier is arguing and Kelly is arguing, we have a good box and a bad box in our head, and we attribute a set of values to the good box and a set of values to the bad box, and the instant we can tick someone off as having either a bad quality or good quality, we assume that because they tick the one feature, they must have all of the other features that go in the good box, or all of the other features that go in the bad box too. And we lump people in those boxes accordingly. There was a philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, Lithuanian-born, but lived a lot of his life in France, who developed a very complex and involved philosophy, a key feature of which was this notion of the tête-à-tête, the head-to-head meeting. This, he proposed, was something that technologies like the telephone and increasingly social media counteract that for most of our history in humanity, when we didn't have these technologies, if we wanted to talk to somebody, we had to sit with them and talk to them. We saw them. We told them a joke, we could see them laugh. We said something horrible, nasty to them, we could see them getting angry or upset or tearful or whatever. We had immediate visual interaction between us and them. Then we get technologies that put barriers. So you can sit on a phone and talk to somebody 1,000 miles away and not see the reaction. You can sit on a laptop or whatever device it might be, type messages onto Twitter or Facebook or whatever it may be, and people 1,000 miles away can read them, and you have no idea whether they're laughing or they're crying or they're raging or whatever, because you have no direct tete-a-tete, no visual direct context, and likewise they have none with you. So when you type what you think is a joke, they have none of the body language, the tone of voice, none of the cues that we've spent almost all of our evolution learning about and understanding. So the way they interpret it might be totally different from the way you intended it. And that, Levinas says, leads to a lack of humanity and compassion. That we fly into a rage thinking someone is being offensive, we don't pause long enough to allow them the benefit of the doubt. To allow they probably didn't mean it the way we have initially interpreted it. So we attribute bad motivations to people without any direct reason to do so, without any direct experience of them, encounter with them, no immediate body language, tone of voice, any of that might lead to realising actually they're making a joke, or they just didn't explain what they meant very clearly, and so we can ask them questions and they sort of go into greater detail and think, oh, that's what you meant. We lose the basic humanity of interaction. And Lanier is arguing very much that's a large part of the problem with social media, is that we fly off the handle very, very quickly and respond to people in ways that are very unfair to them. And they equally respond in ways that are very unfair to us, because we lack that kind of interaction. And it's that lack of fairness, lack of compassion, lack of nuance that leads us to say, oh, well, you said this one thing and immediately I'm going to put you in the bad box. Or you said this one thing and I'm immediately going to put you in the good box. Without realising you don't fit into either box. And it leads to extremism, it leads to reaction. Now, there's a bunch of posts from various people I've never heard of there, saying all sorts of quite extreme, horrible things on social media, being abusive to people from different groups, flying off the handle. This is part of both what Lanier and Levinas argue, that this kind of nastiness and unpleasantness would be very difficult to develop face to face. Who would actually go up in front of another human being and say to them, commit suicide now, you're an awful, terrible person? Well, there's probably somebody somewhere in the world who would say that to another individual's face, but very few people would, and the majority of people who type these vile messages on the internet would probably not actually say them face to face to another person, partly maybe because they get a smack in the mouth, but also because if you could see how upset that person was when you got to them and say, commit suicide now, or something equally as unpleasant, you would stop halfway through saying it, because you'd think, oh my God, what am I saying? I've really upset this person, I've said something really vile, and your humanity would kick in. You would stop putting them in a box, in the very, very negative construction you have in your mind, because, oh, you've said this one thing, you've done this one thing, therefore you must be a dreadful person, and you have got to be shoved in the dreadful box. You'd stop doing that and you'd see them as a more nuanced individual. Because even though Kelly's ideas were developed pre-internet, and he was saying pre-internet people are prone to these kind of polarised forms of thinking about other individuals. As Lanier argues, that has perhaps become 10 times worse post-internet, because we now engage with each other purely on the basis of one tweet, one Facebook post, one whatever it may be, one short comment, and immediately we put people into a camp which is either the very good box or the very bad box, and we have none of the nuance and the subtlety, because our mental constructs are becoming more rigid. And as Lamia says, the whole process of likes and dislikes and so on is a behavioural conditioning process used by forms of social media that help to reinforce people. So if you put up a post and you get 1,000 likes for it, that reinforces you to keep on thinking in that way. And that way may be a very rigid way of thinking, a very limited way of thinking that lacks, and even though maybe of the 1,000 likes, 998 of them are from people you've never heard of and will never meet again and know nothing about, it nonetheless reinforces that sense of I've got to keep thinking like this because people approve. And so people become very rigid, very fixed in their thinking. The mental constructs exhibited by whatever it is they've posted become reinforced. And where it's challenged, as we were saying earlier, somebody posts, let's say, a counterpoint, and there's a bit of argy-bargy going backwards and forwards, the counterpoint may not many times result in the individual going, actually, fair enough, you've got a point there, I never thought about it like that. It often does not result in reasoned interaction. Frequently it results in people flying off the handle and reacting with what was described earlier as hostility. You are challenging my mental construct. I'm going to explode and rage and rant because the challenge to my construct is perceived as a challenge to my very existence, because that construct is so central to my sense of who I am. It's a core construct rather than a peripheral construct, at least at that point in the individual's lives, bearing in mind that what constitutes core today, 10 years from now, may have become a peripheral construct, and some other construct may have become more core to my sense of identity. So when you are of working age and you've got a job, that job may become a core part of your sense of self, whereas when you were 8 years old, it wasn't on the horizon, it wasn't part of your sense of self. So over the course of time you acquire constructs that can become core, and when you retire or change to a totally different job or whatever, that maybe it becomes peripheral, and so what goes in and out changes over time. But we have, and you can see this in arguments around notions of identity and constructions of identity, and how the things that a different culture which changes over time and changes from one country to another country, what's considered a key feature of someone's sense of who they are in one period of history or one part of the world may be very different from what's considered a key sense of who they are in a different period of history in a different part of the world. So issues like gender and ethnicity and religion and which party you vote for and all of that sort of thing. For one person, their political voting may be hugely central to their sense of self. For another person who hardly ever bothers to vote at all, politics may be completely peripheral and hardly relevant at all to a sense of self. So those core constructs, particularly when they become self-constructs, if they are challenged, that can pose a sense that the other person, by challenging an idea, by asking an awkward question, by making what might be a throwaway comment, is in some sense almost eradicating you as a person. Which Kelly would say speaks more to the vulnerability of the construct than to any real or actual threat that is going on. And therein opens up a whole can of discussion, which we'll have to leave for another occasion and another talk and debate, as to what is or what should be part of our self-construct, and of how those self-constructs change from one culture, one period of history, or even indeed one generation. So you can find people, let's say, in their 70s and 80s who have a set of self-constructs, which are very different from people in the same culture who are in their 30s and 40s, and maybe very different again from people in their teens and 20s. So even within one culture, from one generation to another, there may be noticeable differences in what are considered to be important self-constructs and important understandings of the self. What is important to one generation may not be important to other generations within the same culture, let alone travelling between different countries and different cultures. From Kelly's point of view, the healthy mind, the well-adjusted mind, is one that has more than one egg in the basket, more than one sense of self-construct. If you have only one or two self-constructs core to your identity on which you are absolutely, utterly dependent, if they are threatened, either because somebody says something rude to you on social media or by more overt threats, then your sense of self can crumble completely and your life can fall apart very quickly. So going back to the student who was writing about plastic surgery and so on, if somebody's sense of self, let's say they're a very handsome or a very beautiful person, they've always been very glamorous for decades and decades of their lives, and then time begins to take its toll, the wrinkles set in, gravity takes its toll, things begin to go a bit south, and they look in the mirror and they feel that they're not as glamorous as they were 5 years earlier. They worry that that core sense of who they are is going. If I am not this beautiful, handsome, glamorous person, who the hell am I? That sense of self is being threatened by the passage of time. Or maybe an injury or an accident or a disease that ravages the appearance and really threatens that sense of who I am. If I am not beautiful, who am I? Now, the person with many senses of selves, many constructs, may say, well, all right, okay, my looks are going, but I've still got my intelligence, I've still got my bank account, I've still got my artistic talents, I've still got this, that, the other. So even if one part of them begins to fade, there's other parts that are still very central. And they are much more likely to cope well in life. The person who's only got one or two core self-constructs, who feels those core constructs to be threatened, and whether their feelings are realistic or not is almost besides the point, they feel they are being threatened. They are much more likely to collapse in a heap when they are threatened, because they've got nothing else to replace it with. The more nuanced, the more involved, the broader the array of senses of self you have, the easier it is to shrug off rude comments on social media, the easier it is to shrug off the passage of time. Or let's say your self-construct has been that you've always been wealthy, and then you have bad investments or something and you lose your money, but you have other core constructs to turn to. So any core construct potentially can be lost over time. If you have more than one or two, you've got an array, you're more likely to do well in life than if you have a very limited set of senses of who you are. About politics, and even though during Brexit and the Trump administration, and there's been one political polarisation after another, some in Britain, some in America, some in other parts of the world, as people have been at each other's throats, his point is that all of that is a bit of puppeteering and illusion. The real problem with social media, he says, is not whether it's very right-wing or very left-wing, but its tendency to dumb people down, to reduce our subtlety, to reduce our nuance, to polarise us into extremist ways of thinking. Now, whether it's left-wing and right-wing extremisms, or it's religious extremisms, or it's any other kind of extremisms, is almost besides the point. The trouble is, extremist thinking is, to use an Americanism, dumb thinking. It's dragging people's intelligence, their subtlety, their nuance, their compassion, their understanding of a wider array of what the world is like and what they themselves are like and what other people are like. It's dragging that down in a very unhelpful, destructive fashion. and that needs to be challenged. It needs to be overcome. And that is perhaps a topic of discussion for another time, but I'll end here. Thank you for listening.